conclusions from the primary source evidence that has become available since the opening of the Trotsky archive and the very partial opening of some former Soviet archives. An accurate understanding of the history of the Stalin period of the Soviet Union is essential if we are to learn the lessons, both positive and negative, of the experience of the first workers' state. And we do not know that history now. All versions of that history, the Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev Soviet versions, including the Gorbachev version, the Trotskyist version, and of course, the Cold War overtly anti-communist versions, all of them are wrong, concocted out of lies. Many of these lies originated in the Soviet Union itself, from Khrushchev and his writers, and then from Gorbachev. The accounts written in the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, and those written by the Chinese Communist Party when they were friendly to Stalin and hostile to Khrushchev, are also very limited in their usefulness. The Stalin-era Soviet versions do not reflect many of the most important contradictions within the Soviet Communist Party at that time. Moreover, these pioneer communists seriously misunderstood the results of the policies they were following, in which they believed would lead to socialism and then to communism. The Chinese Communist Party had little real evidence to go on. Moreover, contradictions similar to those in the Soviet Communist Party and in the Soviet Union were also playing out within the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese communists could not properly evaluate and learn from the experience of the Soviet Union, or understand how its pro-capitalist tendencies had originated and were developing. If we do not learn the lessons, both positive and negative, of the Stalin period of the Soviet Union, we are at best doomed to repeat their experience, which means to repeat their failure. For the Soviet Union did not develop into communism. It is essential to the working class of the world that we learn what the Soviets did that was correct and positive and worthy of imitation, and what they did that was negative, tending towards the restoration of capitalism. I'm glad to be able to contribute in some small way towards this important goal. Thank you. Now we have, I want to, at this point, before the Q&A, it's just going to take a minute, okay? Before the Q&A, I want to say something about my new book, all right? Good news and bad news. Thank you for attending my talk today on the vital issues of Soviet history of the Stalin period. My new book, Bloodlands, this is what it looks like, was scheduled for publication on July the 1st. I should have had copies available for you to see and purchase today. However, the printing company that Red Star Press is using for my book failed to properly reproduce the two Cyrillic alphabets, Ukrainian and Russian, and the Polish alphabet. In the footnotes, these alphabets did not reproduce at all. In the text, they are irregular and ugly. Consequently, the whole first run of 100 copies had to be trashed, costing my small publisher over $1,000. My publisher and I have now gone over the new file several times. We have ordered a printed proof copy. This way we can guarantee that the next printing will be correct. Otherwise, we're going to get a proof copy and a hard copy, right, before we print. But the next printing will not be ready until approximately September the 1st, or maybe a week or two beforehand. So I do not have it for you today as I had planned. As compensation, I do have my other two books. As compensation for this disappointment, Red Star Press and I are glad to make the following offer to those who pre-order and prepay for a copy of my book, Blood Lies. 1. A pre-publication price of $25, $20 if you pay cash or check today. Red Star Press and I will pay the $5 shipping. I will sign and date your copy when I get it, just as I would if I had it here today. And second, a free copy of my article, The Official Version of the Katyn Massacre Disproven, Discoveries at a German Mass Murder Site in Ukraine, which was published last August in Socialism and Democracy. Normal cost, I sell these when I go to my book talks like today, is $3, because that's what it cost me to have them reprinted in this fashion. I will include a free copy of that if you pre-order and prepay a copy of Blood Lies today. I have a little form to take advantage of this copy. Please fill out the form and give it to me, Grover Furr. I will pass these around. You, of course, are not obligated to do it, but if you wish to do it, take one of these forms. I'll pass them around. I have some more. Just pass them around if you think you might be interested in it. I have others run out. All right, so that's both the good news and the bad news, right? The bad news is it's not here for you today. you'll have to wait a little bit. The good news is you'll get it a little cheaper, and you'll get a free copy of my article if you pre-order it today. Okay? The other two books that I have published are available. Murder of Sergei Kirov, which I spoke on last year, Khrushchev Live, which I spoke on a couple of years ago, are available. And I do have copies of my article from Socialism and Democracy, the official version of the Katyn Massacre Disproven. This came out last August, so I didn't have it here last year when I spoke. I think it's important, because I wrote it, because the Katyn Massacre is this huge thing. It's this immense institution, and it's extremely significant to know for sure that the narrative that we are given about the Katyn Massacre cannot possibly be true. That doesn't tell us what really did happen. We have to speculate. But the narrative that we are constantly given cannot possibly be true. Not because I say so, but because of these archaeological finds in Ukraine. That having been said, all of that, I think it's time for the Q&A. If you have questions and so forth, this is the time. Yes, ma'am.
Can we buy your article today?
Yeah. Let's do that. Absolutely. I would like very much to sell you some articles. Certainly. I want to spread the word about this. By the way, I've sent it to some people abroad, and it's already available on the internet in several different languages, German, Italian, French, and so forth. A pretty important issue. Yes, ma'am.
You said something about the chaos of the Soviet Union in '34. Is that right? Do you remember?
During the famine, yeah, sure.
Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Well, what I meant was people were moving around all over the place. It wasn't 34, it's 32, 33. Okay. But it was a very serious famine. And it was not clear that this famine it was not clear the extent. All right? It was not clear from any one area that this famine was taking place in many, many other areas. I discussed this in the book in some detail. The famine wasn't caused by one environmental cause. There were a number of different environmental causes which worked differently in different parts of the country. So the central government, for example, or even the republic governments like the Ukrainian government, didn't realize until fairly far into 1932, maybe into November or December, that there was a widespread famine, not a local famine. Local famines were even more common. It was not clear. Also, going into this to some extent, one of the environmental causes was a certain particular kind of what's the name of this stuff?
Rust?
Well, it was rust, and rust is a name for a certain kind of growth, okay, that fastens upon grain. And this one kind of rust leaves the ear of wheat looking normal. And it isn't only when somebody goes up and rubs it and so forth to see what the seeds look like, which means it has to be mature to a certain extent, that you find that they are hollowed out and they crumble into dust. So that it took a long time before it was recognized that this famine took place. So that this famine was widespread. It wasn't recognized. And therefore, when this happened, when the recognition took place, and it took place at different places at different times, there was a lot of chaos. And the government then, when they finally figured out what was going on, had to go around and try to collect as much grain as they could so they could share it. For example, in the cities where grain wasn't grown. This is the portrayal you get in, and I think some of it, at least, probably a lot of it is true. You know, the requisition teams went out and just went to the peasants and said, okay, how much grain do you have? We're going to take all but that's essential for you to survive. And, of course, that was a tough thing to do. But they really had no alternative. So there was armed resistance in some places. There was a lot of doubt within the party. And I go into this in the book. But the Tauger's conclusion, and he's spent his life studying this stuff. I have a lot of respect for him. And his conclusion is this famine was caused not by collectivization, it certainly wasn't deliberately caused. It was not by grain exports, to earn money for industrialization. It was caused because it was simply such a bad famine that there wasn't enough food to feed everybody. Now he has come close to ruining his career saying this because you're not supposed to say that.
Right.
You're supposed to blame Stalin or the Soviet government or something like that. And he's not a leftist, so he really feels indignant that he's, in some sense, been professionally penalized for coming to this conclusion. He's a real straight shooter. I've been in touch with him for many years. He's not at all a leftist. So I think, but this is...
Are you familiar with this? I read in Monthly Review when Minky Lee said about a famine in China,
Yes,
that it was caused by people had not been working as long and hard as they were during the revolution, or after the revolutionary process, as they had been before. They were getting up off the ovens, off the warmth in the winter and working. Because that was part of the change that was going on, and so there wasn't enough food to feed them, or they were hungrier. It was a kind of interesting notion.
I don't think that there's any... yes, I'm familiar with that theory.
Okay.
I have been studying Chinese for many
I'm
years,
sure.
and I'm trying to read some materials on the famine. And I'm certainly no expert on it, but I am not convinced that there is. Certainly there hasn't been the kind of study of the Chinese famine, objective study, that from any side, from the Chinese side or from the anti-communist side, which is the side that's much better known, Mao killed 30, 40 million people, there's no Mark Towler of the Chinese famine. But I really don't want to. I read a few things here and there, but I mean, I'm not convinced on any evidentiary basis by any of the accounts that I have read. And I've recently read, I admit it's only a summary, but the Chinese government's sort of semi-official response. And I'm not convinced by it either, to tell you the truth. So, yes. But there's an attempt to say, and I mentioned this when I was in China a month and a half ago with Al Sardis, who's here. Al, yes, sir. I said, because I was invited to speak about Stalin. Al was invited to speak about military matters. I said, Chinese really should be interested in this because the simple form of the anti-communist line in the West is Stalin killed 20 million people and Mao Zedong is China's Stalin. So you better sit up and take notes. But they already knew that. Turned out they already knew that very, very well. Yes, sir.
Dr. Furr, I had a question about Katyn Forest.
Yeah.
What do you make of the evidence of General Walter Schulenberg,
Yep.
where he states in an interview at Nuremberg that he was aware that Goring concocted a plan to blame the Soviets for Katyn Forest and brought 20,000 Polish prisoners to the Soviet Union and assassinated them in 1941. Do you give no credence to that?
I don't want to be disrespectful, but I don't think that's what happened. I have never heard that Schellenberg made such a statement. There is something interesting about Schellenberg, but not that. I've searched his memoirs. Walter Schellenberg was the head of the SD, which is essentially not the SS's intelligence. Walter Schellenberg was the head of the SD, which was the Sicherheitsdienst, which is the SS's intelligence bureau, and he was captured after the war, and he wrote memoirs, and then died in the early 50s. But he clearly was angling to get a job with the Germans or the CIA, and of course not to go to prison. The New York Times reported in 1945, June or July 1945, a little short article that Schellenberg had been captured and that he was being interrogated by the Allies and that he had admitted that Katyn was fabricated by the Germans, by the Nazis. But when the account of his interrogations came out and then his memoirs came out, nothing was said about the Katyn massacre. So there is a book about Schellenberg, and I ordered it some years ago. This is all on my webpage. It's on my, I have a webpage on the Katyn. And the biographer of Schellenberg said, Schellenberg was brought to Germany for interrogation on a certain date, but we'd only have interrogations starting about a week from that time. And he says, well, it's a little hard to believe that they didn't have any interrogations in that period. But if they did, that period, those interrogations are missing. And that was the period when this New York Times article appeared. So something was going on there. But I don't believe it's the case that what this gentleman just said. At least I don't remember ever having heard about that. If you could find that information, I'm glad to give you my contact information. I would be very glad to take a look at it. I think that if that had been the case, we wouldn't be talking about the Katyn massacre now. Some Nazi had said the Nazis fabricated it. We wouldn't be talking about it. But anyway, if I'm wrong, then you please straighten me out. Yes.
These officers who were massacred at Katyn, they were right-wing Polish officer class, admirers, some of them, of Nazi Germany, fervently anti-Soviet.
Mm-hmm.
Why would the Nazis and that collaborationist Polish military force, why would they have killed these officers? Why would they have executed them?
First of all,
Or am I wrong in my characterization of the officers?
well, I mean, you're not entirely wrong. Of the either 14,850 something or 22,000 Polish prisoners, about 9,500 were in fact military officers. The rest were other folks, including policemen, foresters, and various kinds of civilian figures. So about 9,500 were officers. Why would the Germans have killed them? Well, the simple fact is we don't really know. There is a story out there. One Russian researcher claims he has seen in Russian archives, whatever it's worth, that the Germans captured these men and offered to spare their lives if they would join the German army. And if they didn't, they were shot. But the answer is we really don't know. They were, in fact, Poles. I mean, there are a lot of Germans with Polish names, and there are a lot of people who are ethnic Poles or could be considered ethnic Poles in the German army. And in fact, after the Germans occupied half of Poland in 1939, they offered to make German citizens out of any Poles who seemed like they might be ethnic German, whatever the hell that meant. So we really don't know. I don't claim to have solved the mystery here. But it's certainly the case that in the case of these two Polish policemen, their badges were found at this mass grave in Vladimir Volynski. And if you read my article, you'll see that, summarizing from the Polish report, something like 98% of the bullets, of the shell casings found at this mass grave are all German, and they're dated 1941. So there's no question that at least those two guys, but it can't be the case that these were the only two people. These are just the only two people whose badges, the only two Polish policemen whose badges were found there, or that we know were found there. Because believe me, if they find any more stuff at that mass grave, they're going to tell us. They were very sorry that they found them. The reason that these graves were, I mention it, but I just mentioned it briefly in my article. The reason the Polish and Ukrainian governments provided the funds to excavate this particular mass grave at Vladimir Volinsky is that they had bad information. Their information was that these were graves of victims of the Soviet NKVD who shot people in 1941 as the Germans were advancing. That was their information. So, in order to find yet more evidence of more Soviet atrocities, you know, but you can't get enough candy, you've got to have more, you know. The Polish and Ukrainian governments funded these excavations, which are, you know, quite expensive. And of course, they found out to their horror, these are not mass graves of Soviet NKVD victims. These are mass graves of Nazi and Ukrainian nationalist victims. The Ukrainian national, I point that out here too as the relevant scholarship. These mass graves are actually on a property which is on Stepan Bandera Street, a street that's been named after the head of the Ukrainian nationalist hero, right, who was a Nazi himself and also a Nazi collaborator, and whose men participated in shooting these very victims. So the whole thing is very embarrassing for the Polish and Ukrainian nationalists. So no matter what they discover, we're never going to hear about it. We're never going to hear about it. They may find all kinds of other stuff. We're never going to hear about it. We're lucky we heard about it this time. As I point out in my article, which I urge you all to read, the Ukrainian, I mentioned that the Polish report about these excavations in November 2011 mentions one of these badges, only one, not two, and it's very cryptic. There's a little footnote, and you have to know what all the little numbers are. You have to know how to decode all that stuff. You have to be very, very familiar with the evidentiary basis of the Katyn Massacre in order to understand it at all. But the Ukrainian report, which I also quote from, doesn't mention either badge. Just glosses over the whole thing, and that's the major find, right? They don't want anybody to know about this stuff. We're never going to find out anymore, all right? Because who else is going to be doing excavations there? Not you and not me. So that's what's going on here, okay? So the answer to your question is we really don't know. And I don't know that, I mentioned in my talk, I don't know that we're ever going to know. But we do know that the narrative, you know, is the chain, the narrative supported by a chain of supposed evidence. That is the official narrative of the Katyn Massacre. The book by Anna Chinchala, published by Yale University Press, the Annals of Communist System, called Katyn, Crime Without Punishment, 800-page thing. This is the official account. There's a similar account in Polish, of course. Cannot possibly be true. It can't be. That's to be very interesting. Yeah. Yes.
About, can you explain the falsehood about the anti-Semitism on Stalin's part?
Yep.
You say that anti-Semitism did grow in the Russian population, and it was due to being occupied by the Nazis.
I said it had to have increased during that period of time.
That's what I'm not, like, I don't understand why would it increase if the population was being occupied by, like, an army that was anti-Semitic. Like wouldn't the people being occupied kind of resist that?
Somebody did. Some people did. But there was a lot of collaboration of various forms. If you wanted to have a job, if you were in the Nazi-occupied Soviet Union, you had to have a job. All right? Well, I mean, if you lived in the city, right? Which means you were working for some sort of German outfit or other. Okay? So you know, if you were a school teacher, you had to teach to some extent what they taught you. And if you were a student, you had to learn what they taught you. And they were always talking about how the Bolsheviks were Jews and the Jews were taken over. It was, you know, I mean, there was lots and lots and lots of anti-Semitism. And it's just logical to conclude that this had some impact. Of course, there had been traditional anti-Semitism in these countries, although nothing like there had been in Poland. But nevertheless, there had been plenty of anti-Semitism under the Tsars, and that wasn't that long ago either. So, you know, I don't think it's a reach to say that there were people who were anti-Semitic in the Soviet Union after World War II. The question is not whether there were people who were anti-Semitic. The question is whether the policy of the Soviet government and Stalin were anti-Semitic. That's what I discussed. See, that's what Snyder alleges, with phony quotations, and phony evidence, and that's what I go into in the book. Yes, ma'am.
On the same subject, I once received a letter from a woman who lived in Japan, married to a Japanese, but she said in her letter that her family, she was born in what her family called a concentration camp in eastern Russia. And what she was asking me was, and they had originally come from Lithuania or somewhere to the west, and she was asking me, why did the Soviets and Stalin move our family to a concentration camp? And my only answer, I didn't know anything, but my logical answer was to save your family from the Nazis.
Probably.
And my question is, to what extent did they do that? Did they move whole, peoples or groups eastward? And isn't that an example? Isn't that some evidence to show not only were they not anti-Semitic, but they were trying to save the Jewish population?
Oh, they were Jewish. These people were Jewish.
I'm
this
sorry,
woman was Jewish.
a Jewish woman.
Okay.
The person who wrote to me was Jewish.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know in that particular case. I caution you, I would say that, let's put it this way, in the case of Poland, that is to say, Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, and also Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, a lot of people were deported, that is to say, shipped east. Not in general to concentration camps. First of all, if it's the family, they were not in a concentration camp. You could call it whatever you like. Families were always exiled. That is to say, they were moved someplace else and either set up in a town or set up out in the countryside and said, okay, now you've got to work in whatever it is, right? And that's not the same thing as being sent to a camp that's got barbed wire around it and all that kind of. That's a concentration camp. So there's a little confusion about that. But, they were shipped out. In Poland, you get to Lithuania in a minute. In Poland, the eastern Poland, western Ukraine and Belarus, it was the settlers, so-called, along with policemen and the Polish infrastructure, governmental infrastructure. When Poland took, in 1919 and 1921, there was something called the Polish Soviet, or the Polish Russo-Polish War. Okay, Poland invaded the Russian Soviet Federation. The Soviet Union wasn't formed until 1923. And there was a war, and the front moved back and forth, but ultimately the Soviets made peace, and they had to yield a large part of Western Belarus and Western Ukraine to Poland. There were Polish population was a minority. In some cases a large minority, in other cases a small minority, depending on the part, but they were a minority. So they got this area by conquest, and what the Polish government did was to ship, after 1921, to send settlers who were largely former military officers, gave them land, which had been confiscated from whoever, and the process was called Polonization. That is, make it more Polish. We've got to send some Poles out there, because right now there aren't many Poles there. And they also exercised various kinds of forms of official and legal discrimination against Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews. So that gradually the schools were closed, cultural institutions were closed in these countries. They wanted to ultimately make everybody Polish. And this accelerated in the 1930s. Poland moved sharply to the right. It was pretty far to the right to begin with, but it moved sharply to the north after Pilsudski died. So this group of people were identified, arrested, and deported. And when it came to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, something similar happened. Okay, that is to say, people who were officials of the government. These are all very right-wing governments. The Soviets were very concerned about that. Took some tens of thousands of people from these different countries, and with their families, and moved them various places inside the Russia, which was a huge country. So that's why they did it. Now, in today's Poland and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the language that's used is, this is genocide.